This week on the Wheelhouse, Harris, Trump on the debate stage for the very first time. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This right here is the Wheelhouse, the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. Last night, Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump took to the stage for a night of, well, theatrical debating, shall we say. Mics were muted, questions were diverted, and I'm pretty sure moderators David Muir and Lindsay Davis need some naps and trips to the spa after trying to manage it all. This hour, what are the big takeaways from last night's presidential debate? Later on in the show, traveling back in time to see how debates have evolved since the 1960s. Good morning, everybody. Joining us this morning, Bilal Siku, Associate Professor of Politics and Government at the University of Hartford. Good morning, Bilal.
Good morning, Frankie.
Keep going.
Go Hawks.
There you go. It wouldn't be right without a nice Go Hawks. And we hope you're recovering nicely. Thank you for joining us while sick. Jonathan Wharton, Associate Professor of Political Science and Urban Affairs at Southern Connecticut State University. Good morning, Preppy Prof.
Good morning, Frankie, and go Owls.
Oh, go Owls. There we go. It's new. We like the Owls, too. And we like you, and we want to know your thoughts about last night's debate. Candidates hit? Any misses? Give us a call, 888-720-9677. First off, gentlemen, was there a clear winner in last night's debate? Did someone win? Was there a loser? Did we all lose?
That's a great way of asking the question, Frankie. I thought it was a great night for the vice president. She went into this debate with, I think, at least three things she needed to accomplish. One was to introduce herself to the country. A lot of Americans don't know who Kamala Harris is, and I think she did that quite well. I think she needed to answer questions about what her policy agenda is going forward and how she might, in fact, differ from the current path that Joe Biden has been on. And I think she also did an excellent job of doing that. And third, I think she needed to answer questions about any kind of evolving policy positions she's had over the years on a range of different issues. And I think she addressed that quite well. And I think also that when people look back on this particular debate, it wasn't even close. She scored a knockout, I think, and quite easily. And the fact that Trump showed up after the debate in the sort of room with the reporters to try to say it was his best debate ever, I think is an indication that he knew it wasn't a good night.
Jonathan, did you see it similarly? Did your judge's scorecard have a knockout, TKO, or did you see it a different way? Was it closer?
I think she did well. You know, I'll give her credit for that. Obviously, she's a trained lawyer, so she knows what she's doing. The only thing was that she seemed to dodge a couple of areas, which shouldn't be surprising as we see this in kind of debate. This was inclusive about the economy and specifically the inflation, because that was brought up a couple of times, and she wasn't specific how to respond to that. At the same time, of course, Trump did what Trump does, and of course was dodging everything and try to go around the questions. And then I think you all know there's been this whole debate, even online, by some people, that it was kind of a gang-up effect on the former president between the moderators, the reporters, and the vice president.
This is a criticism that we're seeing online that Jonathan points out, mostly on Facebook and some conservative sites and things like that. A lot of folks think that the moderators were all over Donald Trump. I tend to think that, particularly in the beginning, they gave him a lot of wiggle room, and it sounds like the time was kind of even. Did anybody have an exact time on it? Was it close? Did the former president, get more time last night than Kamala Harris did?
Actually, he did, probably about 5 or 6 minutes more time. I think what's interesting about the post-discussion analysis, and I actually watched a little bit of Fox News to try to see how they were viewing it. And Brent Holmes said, clearly Kamala Harris won that debate. And I think most Republican lawmakers feel the same way. I mean, obviously, with 2-minute responses to questions, you don't have enough time to really dive deep in. But I think what she did also quite effectively that really showed going into this debate, the way Republicans have framed her as being someone's dumb, which is racist and misogynistic. I mean, we know that. Connected to that is that she's weak and won't be able to stand up to strong men. And third, she's unpresidential. She doesn't have what it takes to sort of present herself as a president. And I think, again, she hit it out of the ballpark on all three. She proved that she has a command of policies, and I think in a very impressive way. And she might not have answered everything as fully as people would have liked to have seen, but I thought she did really well on a lot of things. In contrast, Donald Trump really relied on what were his campaign speech platitudes, right? And many of them fell flat because there was no crowd there to sort of cheer. I think she responded well to the criticism of being weak. She stood up to Donald Trump. I thought the way she walked out to shake his hand in a very assertive way really was the right sort of way to do it. He wasn't really prepared to shake her hand and was in many ways forced to do that. I think also she proved herself to be someone who we could see as a president of the United States. And I think, from that standpoint, she rebutted some of the key sort of criticisms Republicans have lodged at her.
Maya King, politics reporter for NY Times. I read all the copy sometimes. I apologize. The New York Times said in the live chat last night, Maya King, a great friend of the show, thankfully, I'll be keeping an eye on the subtle balance that Harris will try to strike in her debate style. One challenge that women, particularly women of color, often face during debates is a perception of appearing too angry or emotional. But she sought to get ahead of that in the earliest days of her presidential candidacy by framing her campaign as one of joy. Go ahead with that, Bilal. This is somebody that breaks glass ceilings and doesn't really care about all that mess about what people say about her. See the tan suit that she wore at the convention, Bilal.
Exactly. And again, I just think she did a really great job, last night. Clearly I think there are places of, that we can criticize, the debate itself. And I think there's a long-standing criticism from me about these debates. I think, if you're not someone who's in the middle class, who is certainly being talked about, their needs, their interests, then you might have walked away from this debate feeling like this isn't about you. And I think for Kamala Harris to win this thing, she's got to really activate a lot of potential supporters who come out of working class and poor communities, and not much of that debate spoke to their needs and their interests at all. And I think that was a missed opportunity by her.
What about that, Jonathan? Can you talk about the emotional control? Is that something that we had to see from Kamala Harris? Did you think she handled herself well in that regard, or at least was forced to because of all these conventions that we put on people?
Well, that nonverbal communication is certainly an aspect of it, which was interesting. I mean, we have to keep in mind it's the first time presidential candidates have even, shaken hands before a debate. I saw that online since 2016. It's kind of hard to believe that it's been that long, but I guess that's where our politics are right now. We like it this way, apparently, in this country. And then on top of that, I think there's no secret. You could see her nonverbal responses or reactions to some of Trump's platitudes, as the good professor is suggesting and offering. I think that was expected because that's her style. That's the way she is. She's gonna, kind of elicit this out of, kind of responses concerning. At the same time, Trump was aggressive too at times, where he would say, excuse me, I'm talking here, which, I imagine he that's just who he is. And so, especially at the beginning of the debate. And to your earlier point, he wanted to make sure to get himself in there in several instances because, we can't forget what happened at the last debate with Biden. This was certainly very different than the last debate with the current president.
Jonathan, Bilal talks about reaching out to the people that are considered lower socioeconomic backgrounds, not necessarily the middle class, not obviously upper class. What about the people of Connecticut? What should we have gleaned from that yesterday, Jonathan? Is there anything you were listening with as a nutmeg ear, so to speak?
Well, I'm still concerned about this economy business. I mean, maybe that's just me, but I mean, that's an aspect of Connecticut that still remains concerning, and even nationally. Certainly, there are doubts about what to do about inflation. The interest rate business. I mean, go down the list. of what's a problem, what's an issue. And I think that's unique to our state. We haven't arguably even got out of the 1990s in issues and problems and even gotten past the Great Recession that was obviously years ago. So, I'm always looking for ways and pathways economically to kind of do jumpstarts to our economy nationally and certainly statewide. That's no secret. And I didn't see that quite spelled out, coming from Harris and not much from Trump, to be frank with you.
You're hearing a lot about this in the coming weeks. Great survey participation from our listeners, helping shape our election content. We asked listeners of the Wheelhouse for their thoughts on the elections, and more than 700 people filled out our survey, and we had legit responses, 750 of them. It was tremendous. Listeners care most about the economy, immigration, threats to democracy, the climate crisis, and reproductive rights. Those are our top 5 areas of focus. Again, economy, immigration, democracy, environment, reproductive rights. Can you share a big moment, each of you, from the debate that addressed at least one of those 5 topics? Preppy Prof, we'll start with you.
Well, I guess with immigration, it's interesting how it's been debated back and forth about various policies and what can be done, what can't be done. But at the end of the day, a lot of this really, goes back to Congress. And I wish that was stressed and that wasn't added in there. Instead, it went down rabbit holes and unnecessary, than even, falsitudes about what's going on with what's going on in Ohio with these charges of
Are you talking to
Haitian
any?
immigrants.
This is a good point. Are you talking to any Republicans that are saying like, "Hey," especially on the congressional point, that have any kind of frustration with the fact that the larger immigration bill that Congress worked on didn't get passed? Are you hearing that maybe people want the former president to hone in on that more? What are you hearing?
Well, I think it's just what I hear more and more, which is not a surprise, is that it's a strategy. So that if anything, if Trump were to be elected, there'd be at least a tactical approach to deal with this, through Trump. At the same time, I think the assumption is that the Republicans will get the majority, and there'll be a coattail effect from him. And I think either way, it'll more than likely be a split or divided government. I don't think we're going to see both chambers of Congress, let alone the presidency, be all the same party. So that's the only that's really a big thing. And so I fear that we're not going to be tackling immigration as an issue of immigration reform, which has been long overdue, decades overdue. And I think many Americans share that same concern. And there's also the concern surrounding enforcement provisions too, and what to do with some of the migration services and funding too as well.
Yeah. But, at the same time, Frank, I think this is one of those moments when, and I think, Trump certainly laid out his position, or he's laid out his position on immigration, and he's done it for a number of years about what he wants to do. And the question really allowed him to really explain how he would actually deport 11 million people that he says really is an underestimate of the number of undocumented people here in the country. And he had an opportunity. I don't think he provided much of a plan around that. I think a similar thing happened with the Affordable Care Act. For years, Republicans have been talking about getting rid of that thing, and your jaw has to drop to hear Trump say, look, after all of these years, all of these efforts to get rid of the Affordable Care Act, he still has concepts and not anything concrete. And so in some ways, this is really exposing, I think, what frustrates the American people about national politics in our country is that people use these issues to divide the public, to scare the public, to score points against the opposition, but they're really unwilling to move forward with concrete plans and strategies to solve these problems. And immigration is a classic example of that. It is a very effective campaign issue, but it's not one that necessarily, especially on the side of the Republicans, at least at this time, wanted to actually solve. And Trump worked to defeat a compromise that 5 or 6 years ago, Democrats would never have agreed to because it was so conservative and so draconian compared to what Democrats have been positioning themselves on the immigration issue. So, I mean, if I'm just as an American voter, I'm frustrated with this, as Jonathan has sort of laid out, because I don't think a lot of people in Washington are really serious about trying to fix it.
And maybe are they serious about teaching us anything new? If you yourself, you got to put yourself in the mindset of an undecided voter here. Would last night have swayed you in one direction or the other, Bilal?
Yeah, I think for undecided voters who were not familiar with Kamala Harris, I think it was a good night for her. I think she really did an effective, as I said earlier, she effectively introduced herself. She really presented herself as someone who could be president of the United States. Barack Obama had a similar moment like that. A lot of the criticisms of Obama you see are similar here, but now you've added another layer of misogyny to some of the criticisms of Kamala Harris. And so, yeah, I think for independents, open-minded, it was a good night. It gives them something to consider. I mean, will it change the dynamics of this race in a significant way? Probably not. Uh, Trump support is built in, it's deeply rooted, and it is not movable by any stretch of the imagination. Even if he talks about people in Springfield eating, cats and dogs, or talks about sharks being eaten by sharks versus being electrocuted by batteries, it doesn't move that base. They are for him. They will stick with him. So this thing will come down to the battleground states, and it will come down to, can you move some of those undecided people into your camp?
Jonathan,
And many of those, many of
ahead.
those are unaffiliated voters. Something we need to really stress that, right? I mean, these undecided voters, they're not quite party loyalists, obviously, because they're not affiliated with political parties and they're not necessarily affiliated to either personality or leader or their style. So, it's time to catch up, follow up what's going on with the issues. Now that we're past summer, we're past Labor Day, candidates have changed, the conventions are over, we've got an election in a few weeks. It's time for these undecided voters to come off the sidelines.
But really quick, Jonathan, really quick, I got to do this because I got to play something. But we're talking a lot about Kamala Harris, Bilal, is having to introduce herself to the public and to undecided voters. Should Donald Trump be spending more time trying to sway undecided voters? Is he talking maybe too much to his base? I'm hearing that criticism a lot.
Well, I think that's expected, Frankie. I mean, to be honest with you, because that's who he's been relying on, is that hardened 35-40% of voters. And they do matter because they do show up, they do donate, they do engage with one another. So they're truly, truly, dutiful. The Biden coalition, if you want to call it that, was pretty loosey-goosey. It wasn't quite consistent. Even generationally, I don't want to ignore the generation dynamic in that. I think what Harris is attempting to do is kind of build up something a little bit newer, especially among your younger voters. Many of them are undecided. Many of them are unaffiliated voters. The bigger question for these younger voters is they just don't show up. Will they this time around? Who knows, right? They're lucky to cut that 40% when we talk about presidential races. I don't know if that'll be the case where Harris will be that effective at it, unlike Trump, where we know the voters show up.
If you didn't get to hear the debate last night, here are some clips.
Good evening. We are looking forward to a spirited and thoughtful debate.
So let's get started.
His plan is to do what he has done before, which is to provide a tax cut for billionaires and big corporations, which will result in $5 trillion to America's deficit.
We have inflation like very few people have ever seen before, probably the worst in our nation's history.
But understand, if Donald Trump were to be reelected, he will sign a national abortion ban.
Her vice presidential pick says abortion in the 9th month is absolutely fine. He also says execution after birth. It's execution, no longer abortion, because the baby is born, is okay.
This is someone who has openly said he would terminate, I'm quoting, terminate the Constitution of the United States.
Lots there, lots of false or misleading information, of course, as well. Can I get your reactions, guys? I got to give you about 30 to 45 seconds to react. Let's start with the preppy prof here.
Well, they went back and forth on so many different issues. So I think this is just the natural tendency in what Bilal's bringing up. Debates are not, terribly analytical. If anything, they're more gotcha moments and things that they like to do. So what do you expect out of this anyway, especially when you're talking about a forum where they're going back and forth with these issues?
Yeah.
I mean, in general, I agree with what Jonathan said, though I do think that Trump needs to grow his base. He can't just rely on this base. He won't win if he does that. But I think at the end of the day, this was a good night for the vice president in the sense that she really needed to check off some boxes with the American people. And I think she was able to do that. She had some strong moments in her comments about abortion and the way she personalized it. She had I thought, her answer about her racial identity was just magnificent. And I just think that the Trump camp has some work to do if they want to, win this thing in November. And I think that it's going to be a close race. And, the American people, a small slither of the American people will decide the outcome of this election.
No debate here. Two great professors. Very lucky to have them on the Wheelhouse. Jonathan Wharton, Associate Professor at Political Science and Urban Affairs at Southern Connecticut State University, and Bilal Siku, Associate Professor of Politics and Government at the University of Hartford. Thank you, guys.
Thanks a lot, John.
This is the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. When we return from break, we're diving into the history and impact of presidential debates. Give us a call. What did you think of last night's debate? Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public. I'm Frankie Graziano. Last night, Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump faced off in their very first debate. They are the latest presidential candidates to participate in this historic tradition. Televised debates go back almost 70 years. Here to give us a glimpse into the very first televised presidential debates and to help us understand how they've changed throughout the decades, I'm joined by Catherine Kramer Brownell, Associate Professor of History at Purdue University. Catherine, welcome to the Wheelhouse.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on. And Julian Zelizer, Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton University and a CNN political analyst. Julian, thanks so much for joining us here today.
It's great to be with you.
Great to have you on. Folks, we want your calls today. Do you think presidential debates have gotten too theatrical, too much spectacle, not enough substance? Join the conversation, 888-720-9677. Julian, let's start at the very beginning. When was the first televised presidential debate and who was in it?
Well, the first major televised debate was John F. Kennedy and Vice President Richard Nixon in 1960. That's in many ways still the iconic debate, and it wouldn't be replicated until 1976. But for many people, although there's a lot of myth connected to this, it showed how the way the vice president, Richard Nixon, looked against Senator Kennedy mattered as much as any substance that they discussed, and that this was a visual medium. Many people thought that Nixon looked sweaty, nervous, untrustworthy. Kennedy looked dynamic, young, hopeful, to use the language of today. And that was in the end really what catapulted him. Again, there's a lot of myth to this from what we know about polls and even media reaction, but I think the way we remember it became quite defining in terms of how even candidates think about what they need to do in debate and how they have to appear.
And it was as simple as John F. Kennedy Jr. I wasn't alive at this point, but I've always heard this in history class. John F. Kennedy Jr. playing to the television audience, that was a big part of that as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the fundamental part of televised debates is the first part of that term, televised. And I think there was a realization very early on from 1960, and again, we can talk about 1976, the next set of debates, that the camera was really king, that this was not simply about either high oratory or incredible knowledge about particular policy areas, but it was really the way in which you handled yourself. That was what people were measuring when they watched it on television, and that's also what could make or break a debate performance. Again, not just what you said, but how you looked or acted as you said it, and I think that's true right through last night.
1960 wasn't the first time we had a debate, though. They've been a part of our fabric of democracy. Is that correct? We had them before 1960?
Of course, we had them back into the 19th century. Those were some of the famous debate, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which remained, for many people, a high mark in terms of the substance part. But television was the new medium, comes into being in the late 1940s, spreads into American homes in the 1950s, is competing with radio. And by the 1960s is becoming a formidable force, not just with debates, but entertainment and news. And it's something that politicians increasingly have to reckon with.
Catherine, tell me about the relationship between presidential debates and the media. I, of course, a member of the media. Do debates give candidates a chance to control the narrative?
I think they absolutely do. They allow candidates to present their message directly to television viewers and not have to go through journalists that are reporting on a particular candidate and their message. One of the other things that debates have done that Julian spoke about is that it really creates this political belief that television matters more than anything else. And this is something that comes out of the 1960 elections, this belief that TV matters. And so one of the things that candidates and campaigns start to do in the aftermath of the 1960 election is they prioritize television messages. They shift their budgets to advertisements and to appealing to voters directly through television.
Last night, we saw the candidates sometimes outright avoid a question. Is that new, or has that always been maybe a tactic?
I think that's always been a tactic. And you can see that time and time again, a lot of the pressure on moderators, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, when it becomes clear that these debates are simply a platform for advancing the same campaign message that people are hearing through advertisements and on the campaign trail, is that the pressure on moderators increasingly is to push them for follow-ups, to force candidates to actually answer the question. And so I think kind of this debate about the role of the moderator that we have today is a little bit different, because the expectation of them is and the conversation around them is whether or not they will actually fact check certain messages. But there's long been this question about how to get candidates to actually answer the questions that are posed to them.
Julian. Presidential debates and the media interacting in forms of debates. I mean, I think we should dig into this now. We talked about the role of the moderator for maybe the first half hour of the show yesterday. It was what I might consider a masterclass in how to handle the situation. Not a lot of follow-ups and not a lot of fact-checking. Coming in there maybe when it mattered most, like we heard Lindsey Davis talk about reproductive rights there and Trump's mentioning of the execution of babies. Maybe it's more impactful when we hear less, or do we need to hear constant fact checks? What do you think, Julian?
It's a challenge always. I mean, what does the moderator do? Politicians by nature are going to say things that are not exactly true. And so a moderator is sitting there thinking of their role. And that challenge has been heightened by the former president, who says things that are not true all the time. And even his supporters often understand this, but this is the rhetoric he uses. So I think they did a pretty good job. I think saying a little less and fact-checking at crucial moments was beyond appropriate. I mean, some of the things they were fact-checking weren't stretches of the truth or a little bit of a manipulation. These were just things that were outright lies. And I think just interjecting occasionally was very, very effective. It corrected the facts on key points, but it also just reminded viewers each time to think a little bit about what you were hearing and listening to, because sometimes it totally contradicted the record. And so it's a tough situation. He comes at you, the former president, full throttle, and I think they handled it pretty well.
Catherine, who is the audience for debates? There wasn't an in-person audience yesterday, very notably, but who's watching these debates and maybe who's being catered to?
I think there's a lot of discussion in the lead up and the aftermath of debates about independent voters and does this actually change minds? And I think it's important to remember that debates are one moment in a broader campaign. And so they can give you insights into the candidates, and it can allow people that maybe are not familiar with either candidate to hear their message. But I think debates also do something else, and that they're part of their civic ritual that can allow people who are already committed to a particular candidate, that are perhaps tuning in to cheer on their candidate and perhaps even jeer the opposition, it can get them more motivated in the aftermath of this, more motivated to mobilize at the grassroots level, to get out the vote, to fundraise. And so I think that there are a variety of different audiences and different roles that these debates play in galvanizing them.
Thinking about past presidential debates, Julian, any historical candidates who stand out as especially skilled debaters?
Sure. Ronald Reagan was very effective, both in 1980 when he ran against President Jimmy Carter. There is the iconic moment in the debate where President Carter is going through a lengthy discourse about Reagan's record on health care and how he's going to cut Medicare benefits. And then basically, Reagan with his face and his mannerisms and the phrase, there he goes again, basically just dismissed the whole thing. And it was a way to dismiss the argument that he was too extreme for America and almost make light of the substantive argument that Carter was coming across. And he does it again in 84, very effective against former Vice President Walter Mondale, who's the Democratic nominee, including the quintessential moment where concerns about Reagan's age were at work. And he has his quip where he says he won't let age be an issue and he's not going to talk about the inexperience of his more youthful opponent. And so he understood, I think, in ways that sometimes Trump understands pretty well, about how you play to the television camera and how you present yourself in a way that will be appealing. So Reagan, in my mind, was extraordinarily effective at this. And one more would be Bill Clinton. I think really understood the way in which this works as well. And there's the famous town hall where George H.W. Bush, the president, looks at his watch and a contrast on a question about the debt where Clinton is able to convey a kind of empathy and understanding to someone asking him how the debt personally affects them in a way that I think helped fill out the portrait that voters had of who Clinton was. So those are two examples of people who've done pretty well in this form of political combat.
Catherine, anybody you want to point out in particular?
Well, I think that with both Reagan and Clinton, it's important to know that they were very effective in terms of their communication abilities and their performance, but both of them also had very effective spin machines that were very strategic in using those moments that Julian mentioned and replaying them and highlighting that exposes these broader issues. And so I think both of them were effective also because of the spin machinery that's working to shape interpretations of the debate in the immediate aftermath as well.
888-720-9677. Please call us. Get your comments on the air, 888-720-9677. We're going to take a caller here. Tom from Manchester, who thinks some of these debating tactics are falling into the category of disrespectful. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. Tom from Manchester, with African-American background. I did hear about it on the radio, the debate, and I think she kept her cool and tried to stay on point. And I guess there wasn't any good follow-up questions to like Veterans Affairs and education and homelessness, but that's another time. But I felt that Mr. Trump was disrespectful to her, and I believe he's racist, misogynistic, and just plays to his base and only like a wannabe fascist. And he hasn't learned his lesson about
Tom, let me ask you a quick question here, because I think that's a very important thing. I'm going to ask you a really quick one here. Give me a quick answer if you can. When Kamala was asked again about the color of her skin yesterday, a little bit of a different answer than the one she was criticized for with Dana Bash. Was that a powerful moment for you? How did you react to that when she was asked about her skin color and Donald Trump's remarks about it?
It felt good because it shouldn't really matter. Of what color, as long as you're qualified, and she's worked hard to get who she is, and also no one's asking him about his white background and why did his family change their surname from Dooms to Trump. So I mean, he's from an immigrant family too that came for a better life, and he never talked about north of the border instead of south of the border. Thank
you so much for calling in today, Tom. It was so good to talk to you. I appreciate you calling in again.
All right then, thank you.
Stay in touch. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. This hour, we're talking to experts about the history of presidential debates. Coming up, let's take a look at how some of the biggest political figures of the past decade have changed the landscape of presidential debates. Did you catch the spectacle last night? Join the conversation, 888-720-9677. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. You heard from the U.S. presidential candidates last night. Coming soon on the Wheelhouse, candidates for Connecticut's federal delegation. It all begins with a race for a U.S. House seat. Hear from candidates and ask questions. Submit questions ahead of time to wheelhouse@ctpublic.org or call us on the air live. The candidates want to hear from you, 888-720-9677. You can call that number today as candidate interviews are coming soon, but we had the presidential debate last night. Maybe you caught it live, or maybe you've seen clips from it on TikTok or Instagram. This morning, we've gotten into some of the history behind presidential debates, and now we're diving into today. I'm talking to Julian Zelizer, professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University. Also with me, Katie Brunell, associate professor of history at Purdue University. Again, join the conversation, 888-720-9677. Catherine, I want to focus on how social media has changed the way politicians debate. You got the big ones, Facebook. Back in the day, MySpace. Where you at, MySpace, Tom? Twitter, now X. How did they change the way we experience the debates?
Well, as I said in an earlier conversation about the importance of the spin rooms, right? So in the 1980s, especially with the cable landscape where there's more room for analysis and punditry, the campaigns prioritized putting people out there to shape the interpretations of the debate immediately afterwards. And so this spin room has become a part of how people experience the debate. They watch the clips that then are discussed and used in campaign advertisements and are featured on the news. But that happens after the debate. I think the one thing that social media changes is this spin starts to happen in real time. And so before social media, people would come to this national viewing event and experience it together, and perhaps, read things in the next day that maybe changed the way that they were thinking or, presented a particular point of view. But with social media, that spinning is happening in real time. That they're perhaps consuming certain things and rethinking the candidate's message because of that spin. Some of these echo chambers that happen on social media. And so I think that it makes it more of a partisan experience than it previously was.
We touched on this during the last segment, but social media has changed the speed information spreads. That could be dangerous if candidates have their facts wrong or their statements are blatantly false. How does the lack of real-time fact-checking impact the integrity of the debate? Julian.
Well, I do think we shouldn't think this is all new. But I think part of what happens is information just gets out there quickly, and that's part of what Catherine's talking about. It quickly goes without much of a filter to this world of social media where it's chewed on and it's spread. And you could say something that's categorically untrue. As we heard last night, while former President Trump was corrected about the dog and cat story, it got out there and it will continue to circulate. So I think on the one hand, there's more opportunities for fact checking, not just moderators, but everyone else in the fact checking world that will be chewing over this and putting out what was wrong and what was right for the candidates. On the other hand, it's harder to actually contain it because it's not as if fact checkers have immense power. Many people will just hear what they hear, see what they see, and that's the information they absorb. So I think in many ways, it's a perennial problem that's becoming much more contentious, much more pervasive. And the incentives for saying whatever you want, I think, have increased, even if the number of fact checkers have increased as well.
It's a lot of noise, though, Catherine. Like I had my email open during the debate, and I just get email after email from the Trump team There's a lot of noise there. I'm sure there's a lot of noise on social media. Is it making a mark? Is it creating the misinformation firestorm? Where are you at on this? Respond to Julian's comments.
Yeah, I think that it is a lot of noise. And I think that it means that these debates they're a fundraising strategy. There are so many fundraising messages that are kind of going out to supporters during the debates. There are like you can see kind of the partisan operation, again, trying to get those people who are watching, to get them involved, to get them, dedicated to grassroots activism in the aftermath. And so I think there's so many different pieces of the campaign machinery that are working during these debates. And so how people then experience them, it depends on their partisan outlook, their ideological outlook, if they're tapped into those, or if they're perhaps watching them and following the commentary of a social media influencer or a journalist online. So I think the experience that people have, how they're watching it, is just so very different.
We have a caller on the line. Khalil is calling us from Hartford, Connecticut. Go ahead, Khalil. What's your comment this morning?
Hey, Frankie. Good talking to you guys again.
Yeah, nice to talk to you. Thank you for calling in this morning.
Yeah, of course. It was just really disappointing to hear both candidates' answers on the question of Gaza. Kamala Harris, in particular, continued to parrot, this talking point about Israel's right to defend itself. Meanwhile, the Israeli government continues to relentlessly slaughter civilians. She claims she's working tirelessly for a ceasefire, yet she continues to support sending weapons to Israel to bomb civilians. I mean, just recently there was a refugee camp in Gaza that was targeted, dozens of civilians killed. And it's just disappointing to see, this Democratic nominee who's trying to win the votes of Democrats, yet not really addressing this key concern of a lot of voters.
Khalil, it's a big thing because I was listening to The Middle last night and their little show that they had afterwards, hosted by Jeremy Hobson. And there's now pressure on Kamala Harris to walk both lines, to talk about the U.S. ally here in Israel, and then, of course, the people that are dying every day in Gaza. Is that something that you want her to do? Do you care about walking both sides? They're also talking about Michigan voters in particular, and people in Dearborn, Michigan, or Detroit, Michigan, that are not going to be down with Kamala both sidesing it. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's not really about, walking the line. It's about adhering to the law and international law. And if she claims to be the true candidate of law and order, she would stop sending funding and weapons to a government that's slaughtering civilians. I think you can't really let, Israel's allyship of the United States allow us to continue sending them weapons. And I think, voters are not going to be satisfied with a both-siding response. They really want a policy change. They want an arms embargo.
I appreciate it, Khalil. I got to jump out because I only got 5 minutes left in the show, but I'm gonna pivot your question here to Catherine. Thank you for calling us, Khalil. So we're talking about this kind of delicate line that Kamala Harris seems to be towing right now. How is she maybe doing at that? I just want you to comment on it. Or does she have to continue doing that, or can she go in a direction? What are your thoughts there, Julian? You can tell us too if you have some thoughts.
Well, I mean, I think overall, not everyone agrees with the caller, and so part of the challenge of politics is to try to find coalitional positions. I think she's genuinely trying to do that, and I don't know if it will succeed. But the debate was one time, and so was the convention speech, where she decided to talk about this directly rather than avoiding it. And by talking about it directly, I think that signals that she is taking this seriously, and she is trying to work through where this all goes. And finally, there's the ongoing reminder of the alternative. If the alternative is former President Donald Trump, a critic of current U.S. policies, is going to find someone much more entrenched in existing policies, if not policies they find worse. And so I think she's going to have to work this out in the next few months. I don't think it's impossible. And again, because of the alternative, it gives her a little space to try to find a middle and a promise that this will be a priority in the coming years.
Before we wrap up here, there was a lot of pressure for Kamala Harris to have a stellar debate performance last night First time she's gone head-to-head against former President Donald Trump. Just want to say goodbye to Julian Zelizer. Thank you for coming on the show today. We appreciate you having you coming on here. Very big support to the Wheelhouse to have you come on. Thank you, Julian.
Thanks for having me.
Catherine, let me have you answer that last question. First time she's gone head-to-head against former President Donald Trump. We noticed that Harris tried to appeal to Republicans last night, invoking John McCain, other Trump defectors. Strategic? Is this helpful? What do you think about her reaching out?
Well, I think it's reflective of her broader campaign strategy. And, it's very reflective also of kind of how she approached the convention and reaching out, for grounding Republicans at that convention as well. And I do think it's really significant in part because of what happened during the first debate between Biden and Trump, that she's showing that, after Biden had such a disastrous performance, she's showing that, she is now the candidate, and that she can take on Trump in a way that Biden struggled to do. And so I think that it was really part of her strategy. It's kind of building a coalition, countering Donald Trump and the all of the lies that he was espousing, and so that was part of the challenge. And she did a great job, and I think a really effective job, in trying to execute that particular strategy.
Just 30 seconds left or so. Are you seeing something similar from Donald Trump? Is he reaching out to anybody besides his base, and how's that going to impact him?
Well, I think a lot of what he said on the debate stage is very similar to what he has been saying in rallies. And it's a lot of stories that are circulating in a conservative media as well. And he didn't really expand beyond that in trying to appeal to a general electorate. So he seemed, with a lot of his answers, again, a lot of the misinformation that he's also presenting is the same stuff that appeals to his base, and that has galvanized his base over the years.
Catherine, thank you so much for coming on the presidential debates, a history lesson, and for helping us understand last night's debate. Go Boilermakers. Thank you so much. Catherine Kramer Brownell, Associate Professor of History at Purdue University.
Thank you so much. Boiler up.
Thank you so much for coming on the show today. Before we end today's show, I want to take a minute to remember a friend of Connecticut Public and a friend to the state as a whole. Journalist Tom Condon died yesterday. Tom worked for The Current for more than 40 years, and then he worked at the Connecticut Mirror. Tom was also on the Wheelhouse, appearing with former colleague at The Current, Colin McEnroe. Colin wrote a column about Tom yesterday saying, hardly anybody was as interested in finding the truth as Tom Condon. Former host of the Wheelhouse, John Dankosky, said about Tom, I think everyone should know just how important he was to helping us understand our state. Tom Condon was 78. Today's show, produced by Chloe Wynn, edited by Robin Doyen-Aiken. Our technical producer is La Maestro Dylan Reyes. Thanks to Tess Terrible for helping us in studio. Meg Dalton oversees the production of The Wheelhouse, also supported by Megan Fitzgerald. Download The Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse. Thank you for listening.